there is something they never put in the history books. Something that gets quietly skipped over, softened, or simply forgotten by people who never had to live it. But if you actually grew up in a British council house, if you breathed that particular air, walked those particular streets, felt the cold of a January morning, in a bedroom with no heating, then you already know exactly what this is about before I've even started. This is not a story about hardship. Get that thought out of your head right now. This is a story about a generation that built something extraordinary, a whole way of life inside four walls that belonged to the council. And they were proud of every single brick. To understand it properly, you have to go back to 1945, when Britain was in pieces. Almost 4 million homes had been destroyed or damaged during the war. Families were cramped into crumbling Victorian terraces, back-to-back housing, with shared outdoor toilets, coal sheds, and walls that ran with damp. There were no bathrooms, no hot water from a tap. In some of the worst streets, in cities like London, Coventry, and Hull, people were still living in conditions that would have shocked their grandparents. The government of Clement Attlee looked at all of this and made a decision that changed the face of Britain forever. They were going to build, and they were going to build fast. Between 1945 and 1955, just 10 years, over 1 million new council houses went up across the country. 1 million. That is not a small number. That is the largest peacetime housing program, driven by the belief that decent housing was not a luxury. It was a right. The man who carried much of that vision was Aneurin Bevan, the Minister of Health and Housing. A miner's son from Tredegar in South Wales, Bevan knew poverty from the inside. He had not read about it. He had grown up in it, and he had something radical in mind. He wanted the new estates to be genuinely mixed communities, places where, in his own words, the working man, the doctor, and the clergyman would live side by side, not a place where poor people were put to keep them out of sight. A community, deliberately designed, properly funded, and built to last. And here is what the official history always leaves out. Those early post-war council houses were not the crumbling stereotypes that would come later. Many of them were solidly built, well-spaced, with gardens front and back. Between 1951 and 1954 alone, under Harold Macmillan as Minister of Housing, the Conservative government built over 300,000 homes a year, 4/5 of them in the public sector. For a family moving out of a slum clearance, moving into a new council house on a clean estate was not a step down. It was the opposite. It felt like arriving somewhere you had always deserved to be. But the real story of those houses was never in the bricks. It was in what happened inside them. And what happened outside, on the streets and the greens and the allotments, among people who had nothing to spare and gave it freely anyway. That story is what this video is really about. Because there are signs, unmistakable signs, that mark out the people who grew up in those homes. Signs that shaped who you became. And not one of them is anything to be ashamed of. In fact, some of them are the most valuable things a person can carry. But first, let's go back to the beginning of a typical day. Because if you know what that felt like, what hits you first is the cold interior of a quiet, dark hallway with a single radiator or just shadows, emphasizing the absence of central heat. You woke up to cold. Proper, honest, bone-deep cold. Especially between November and March. The kind that made the inside of your bedroom window run with condensation and turned your breath into a small cloud above the blankets. Getting up required a kind of courage. You counted to 3. You put your feet down onto the lino, and it was almost always lino, cold and hard underfoot, and you moved fast. Downstairs, in the front room, someone was already on their knees at the fireplace. Your mum usually, or your dad before the early shift, getting the coal fire going, building it from yesterday's ash, laying the newspaper, the kindling, coaxing the thing to life before the rest of the family came down. That coal fire was not just a source of warmth, it was the center of the house. Everything organized itself around it. Wet shoes dried in front of it. Socks steamed on the hearth. On really cold evenings, the whole family pulled their chairs in close, and the front room became the only room that mattered. The rest of the house, the hallway, the kitchen, certainly the bedrooms, stayed cold. You simply adapted. You wore more layers. You moved more quickly. You learned without anyone ever teaching you that warmth was something you earned and managed, not something that arrived automatically. This is the first sign. If you instinctively turn the heating down before you leave a room, if wasting fuel feels genuinely wrong to you in a way that goes deeper than money, you grew up somewhere that wired that into you permanently, and it is not a bad thing. Not even slightly. Then there was Monday. And if you grew up in a council house, Monday had a very particular smell and sound. Monday was wash day. Every family in the street, every week, without fail. The copper or the twin tub would be going from early morning and out onto the line in the back garden. Or draped over errors indoors if the weather was against you, which in Britain it frequently was. Sheets and shirts and working clothes, everything that had been worn through the previous week, would go through the wash, through the mangle if you still had one. The whole house smelled of soap and steam, and your mother did it without a second thought, because that was Monday. It had always been Monday, and it would be Monday next week too. That rhythm, wash day Monday, ironing Tuesday, shopping Wednesday, cleaning the house through the week, gave life a shape and a structure that nobody ever announced but everyone understood. There was comfort in that predictability. There was dignity in doing things properly, on time, without fuss. The house that belonged to the council was kept as if it belonged to the family, because pride does not wait for a deeds document. And then there was bath night, Sunday, in most homes. The immersion heater switched on, carefully, because electricity cost money, and you did not leave it on a moment longer than necessary. The bathroom, if the house had one, was unheated. You got in, you washed properly, you got out quickly. The whole family used the same water, one after another. Eldest first, youngest last. If you were near the end of the queue, the water had gone grey and lukewarm. No tissues in those bathrooms, just cotton handkerchiefs, washed and ironed on Tuesdays. The toilet paper was hard and scratchy, more like greaseproof paper than anything designed for comfort. The soap was a single bar. The towels were thin. There was nothing superfluous, nothing you didn't need. And somehow, out of all of that limitation, those bathrooms produced people who were clean, who carried themselves with dignity, and who never once confused having less with being less. But the outside of the house told its own story. And that story began before you even opened the front door, the front step. If you grew up on a council estate in the 50s, 60s, or into the 70s, you know exactly what I mean. That front door step was scrubbed, regularly, reliably. It did not matter that the house was rented. Your step was clean. Your net curtains were white. Your windows were polished. These were not optional standards imposed from outside. They were internal ones, held by women who had decided their home would not look like neglect. That pride was everywhere on those streets. Neighbours watched each other's standards, and not unkindly, there was a mutual accountability. The back gardens often had allotments, or at least a vegetable patch. Runner beans up canes, potatoes in a corner, maybe a few rows of cabbages. Food grown at home was food that didn't need to be bought, and that calculation was never far from anyone's thinking. And then there was the street itself. The street on a council estate in that era was not just a road. It was the living room that nobody owned, and everybody shared. Children left in the morning and came back when it went dark. There was the street, the green, the lamppost that served as the wicket in an endless summer cricket game. You made your own entertainment from nothing, and it turned out that nothing produced more imagination than anything that money could buy. Every adult on that street had a degree of authority over every child. Word simply traveled the way it does in places where people actually know each other. The milkman came before dawn. The gentle clink of glass bottles on the step, the hum of the electric float disappearing up the road. The empties went back out, rinsed and lined up by the gate. There was a small economy of care in that system, a ritual of reciprocity. The corner shop knew your family's name, and in harder weeks it knew your circumstances too. The tick book was a real part of life on many estates. You ran up a small tab when the money was short, and you settled it when the wages came in. It was community operating with trust, and without paperwork. Subscribe right now, because this is what we do here every single week. We go back to the Britain that actually was, the one that was lived, not performed. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment below telling us one thing you remember about your estate, your street, your neighbours, your front step. And if this is landing somewhere real for you, share it with someone who would understand. They will thank you for it, because we are only just getting to the part that hits hardest. School was coming. And school on a council estate in those years was a whole world of its own. After the 1944 Education Act, school meals became a formal part of the welfare state, the idea being that every child in Britain would receive at least one proper, nutritious meal during the school day, regardless of what was available at home. For a child growing up on a council estate, this was not a small thing. For many families, the school dinner was the most reliable hot meal of the day, and the meals were particular. If you were at school in the 50s or 60s, you know exactly what was on those plates. Minced beef with boiled potatoes and cabbage, steak and kidney pie, shepherd's pie, corned beef with mash and beetroot, the juice of the beetroot poured over the plate as if it were gravy, and the puddings were their own category entirely. Semolina with a spoonful of jam stirred in, tapioca, sago, rice pudding, jam roly-poly and sponge with custard. There was no choice. One main course, one pudding, and you cleared your plate. It produced a generation of people who simply did not waste food. Every child also received a small bottle of milk each day, a third of a pint, delivered in crates. In winter, when it had sat outside in the cold, it was genuinely pleasant. In summer, it was something else entirely. For families who qualified, there were free school meals. In Glasgow in the 1960s, teachers would call certain children forward with the phrase, "Come out the freeze." Those children had to stand up in front of the class and walk to the front. It was, as one woman who lived through it later described, the walk of shame. The public nature of it carried a cost that no nutritional calculation ever measured. Children noticed. They always do. And the families who sent their children to school with the dinner money when they genuinely could not afford it, to spare their children that walk, were making a sacrifice that deserves to be named. Outside school, the estate itself was the education that mattered most. You learned to read adults, their moods, their worries, the moments when you did not ask for things. You learned the difference between the end of the week when money was tighter and Friday evening when your dad came home and the atmosphere in the house changed. You learned that kindness was not performed for applause. In 1950, only 350,000 homes in Britain had a television. By 1960, that number had risen to nearly 3/4 of all households. On the estate, the arrival of a television set was an event. Families gathered around it. Neighbours came round to watch. The Queen's coronation in 1953 was watched by over 27 million people, many of them crowded into front rooms. It was not consumption, it was communion. The first car on the street was also an event. Hire purchase. The installment plan that allowed families to buy things they could not afford outright had made the television possible. It would eventually make the car possible too. But in the early days, a car in the street was something to look at. Something that told you the family in question had moved into a different kind of possibility. Some felt something closer to recognition. By 1980, council housing accounted for 32% of all housing in Britain. Nearly 1 in 3 homes in the entire country was a council property. Between 1945 and 1979, through Labour and Conservative governments both, Britain built an average of 126,000 council houses every single year. And then came October 3, 1980. The Housing Act came into force, and with it the right to buy. Margaret Thatcher's government gave council tenants the legal right to purchase their homes. For many families, it genuinely felt like liberation. They bought. Of course they bought. By 1990, 1.5 million council houses had been sold. Home ownership in Britain climbed significantly. But here is what was not on the poster. The money from those sales was never reinvested in building replacement council housing. Local authorities were actively prevented by law from building new homes. When Right to Buy was introduced, there were 6.5 million council homes in Britain. Today, there are just 2 million. The communities built up over 35 years were being quietly dismantled. And then something else happened. Something quieter and perhaps more damaging than any policy. The language changed. The words council estate stopped meaning a place where people lived. They started meaning something else entirely. A punchline. A shorthand for dysfunction, failure, poverty of ambition. The media found in it an easy image of everything that was supposed to be broken. But there is a detail that cuts through all of this. And it is not a number. It is something far more precise than that. The detail is this. The council house generation rebuilt Britain after the worst war the world had ever seen. Not the people who owned the land, not the people who ran the banks, the people who lived in those houses. They came from slum clearances and bomb-damaged streets into homes with indoor plumbing and back gardens and enough space for children to grow. They were genuinely grateful, because here is what the people who grew up in council houses actually learned. Not what they were told, what they absorbed. Through daily life, the way you absorb a language when you live inside it, you learned that warmth is earned, that you do not leave a light on in an empty room, not because you are mean, but because you remember when that mattered. You learned the weight of community, not the idea of it, the actual physical weight of it. The neighbor who watched the children, the woman 2 doors down who appeared with a plate of something. You learned patience in that bathroom queue on Sunday evenings. You learned that your needs were not the only needs in the room. You learned how to share a space, a meal, a television set, a coal fire. These are not small lessons. These are the lessons that hold a person steady when the rest of life gets difficult. And the people who learned them, who carry them now, quietly, because what replaced the council estate, the atomized, expensive, privatized world, that world is not progress, it is loss. Measurable, documented, ongoing loss. But this is not where the story ends. Because the people who grew up in those houses are still here, and they know something that cannot be fabricated. You cannot fake where you came from. Not really. You can repackage it, smooth it down, learn to speak about it differently in certain rooms. But the things that a council house childhood put into you, those do not leave. You also knew what joy looked like with no budget behind it. Summer on the estate when the schools broke up and the whole street became your world was as complete a happiness as any holiday abroad. And the houses themselves, the actual buildings, were built to last. The early post-war council houses, the solid semi-detached with proper gardens, were built to Parker Morris standards. What those houses produced, the generation that grew up in them through the 1950s, 60s and 70s, is a matter of record. People who knew that the measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you hold to when things get hard. So here is what I want you to do. Leave a comment below. Tell us your sign. The one thing that immediately takes you back to growing up on your estate. Like this video if it reached something real in you, and share it. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. Every week we come back to the Britain that was actually lived. You came from a place that built you properly, a place that gave you more than it ever got credit for. You were proud of where you came from. You still should be.